Welcome back to the Creation Reformation YouTube channel. This is Jake Ramgren with the third part in my series titled Why a Reformation. These three parts, if you've made it this far, again, appreciate that you've taken the time to invest this much on these important topics, and have hopefully learned some things, and you've kind of followed along with my train of thought on this issue. And this whole series is really here to justify what we're doing with the Creation Reformation movement, trying to bring a new look at the creation account here to the New England area in particular. But this three-part series, of course, is just general. It's me wrestling with some of these important issues. And so I think it can apply to really anywhere you're at. Even though our movement is very specifically focused on the New England area, you could watch this and learn from it wherever you're at. And that's kind of how it is with all of our videos, hopefully. Even though I'm framing this channel as kind of a tour through the New England region from a creation perspective, it's like what I do with my creation museum tours, where I go through a natural history museum and basically give everything from a creationist point of view. That's kind of what our YouTube channel is for New England. So even if you don't live in New England, keep tabs on our YouTube channel, and it would be a great way for you to understand the creation model and also get kind of a virtual tour through the New England region. So that's kind of what this YouTube channel is turning into, and I'm all for it. So today we're with part 3 of a series that is why we need to rethink the Genesis account, because largely it's been thought of as, and it's not to say that creationism isn't a large thing at the moment, but there is, especially in academic circles, even in Christian academic circles, it is very much assumed to be a non-historical point of view, the Genesis account, and this is very much a problem, I think, for me and for a lot of other creationists like me. And so I put together this 3-part series to say why I think Christian leadership, why the church, why Christians, no matter where you're at, where you're from, I think we need to reinterpret and rethink of Genesis as maybe more of a historical narrative, and something that is actually true to history and true to a literal interpretation. So I've organized this series in multiple ways. It was originally called The Briefest History of Time when I did this at PVCA. That's Pioneer Valley Christian Academy, where I first gave these presentations. And I called it that because in my mind, I could organize this 3-part series in a pretty easy way. Part 1 was about creation. Part 2 was about the flood. And part 3 is about where we're at today. And I think that's a very brief but effective history of the entire world and how creationism explains those 3 major points in time. And that's one way of looking at it. And then I could also have organized this as part 1 is about the history of science and history in general. Part 2 is about the scientific evidence itself. And part 3 is about the philosophy or ethics. That's a completely other way you could organize this. And just now I was kind of thinking about this and I was like, look, we could easily organize this 3-part series in a completely different way, which is that part 1 is a response to the claims of theistic evolution, or other words, Christians who accept the evolutionary narrative. And I use the history of science to kind of hopefully debunk some of those claims by theistic evolutionists, and pointing out, really using history, that whenever we let other external things influence our interpretation, it actually doesn't turn out great. And that's where I tried to show through history. And the second part is kind of a response to people who criticize creationism through means of science. It says no scientific evidence for it. And while I did not prove creationism through science or disprove evolution through science, I did show how an alternative model based on a creationist interpretation of the Bible can lead to productive creation research that can compete with the mainstream research that's happening in academia today. So hopefully I made a good case for that. And then the third part here is actually a response to the claims of not theistic evolution, but pure scientism, pure materialism, pure naturalism. However, whatever words you want to say, there's a lot of words that refer to this kind of ideology that says that all truth must be part of this natural physical world. There is no truth outside of it. Metaphysics is not really a thing. Everything can be reduced down to science. It can be reduced down to physical. It can be reduced down to what Nancy Pearcey called the first story. Right? She said that kind of everything was in 2 stories. The first story is the real, the physical, the things we can touch and taste and feel. And then there's a second story, which is like the spiritual. And so she says, that there's very clearly 2 stories, and the materialists try to reduce things down to that one story. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about that today. So I will point out though, and I will come full circle at the end of this seminar and point out that theistic evolution, though it does say, yes, there's a second story, yes, there's a spiritual, it does not actually answer all the questions raised when we dive into this. So I'm going to show a lot of problems with the thinking of mainstream scientists and really mainstream philosophers who try to reduce everything down to science and rule out the supernatural from the beginning. Theistic evolution does not solve all of those things, all of those problems that I have with the naturalists and the materialists and the scientists. And so we're going to dive into that, of course. So this is just kind of a preview that's explaining where I'm at with this third seminar. I do appreciate it if I seem to ramble on a little bit when I come across these slides. I'm very much more used to presenting to a live audience. I'm much more comfortable in front of a crowd of people presenting, and where I can see people and people are paying attention to me and I can explain things to them where they're sitting. It's a lot more awkward for me to talk in front of a camera where I'm not seeing people. So I can kind of tend to feel like I'm just sitting here rambling about things. So I appreciate your patience with that. Hopefully my logic is something that even if you don't agree with my arguments, at least you can follow the logic, you can follow the arguments, and hopefully that's I don't come across as kind of a rambler. So again, I'm much more used to presenting for an audience, and that's why I try to make these things as unedited as possible. Both of the first parts, there is one edit in there because I've had problems with the PowerPoint both times. I've definitely looked at this PowerPoint more this time before I uploaded it here. So hopefully we won't run into any problems, and I can just go through this whole thing without editing any of it and kind of pretend that I'm in front of an audience. So thank you for being my audience. Thank you for spending time to kind of hear my point of view as a zoologist who's going outside of his realm of expertise to talk about some other things. I do have an apologetics minor. So when I got my degree in zoology, my minor of choice was apologetics. So here I'm diving into some argumentation that's often used in apologetics. So I'm a little bit more in my wheelhouse than I was in the first part with the history of science, but I appreciate you taking the time to kind of hear my perspective on things as I try and talk about creationism and bring it more into the mainstream. So with that, let's get started. This is part 3, which I have titled The Darwinian Shift. So again, talking about philosophy, talking about ethics, and talking about where we're at today as a society when it comes to talking about origins and about creation. So as my opener, I want to start with just reading off a quote from a philosopher. And I'm going to actually do this a lot today. A lot of this presentation you'll find is me not really critiquing or criticizing. Well, I'll be doing some of that, but really I'm letting the philosophers eat their own words here. I'm making them own up to the things that they've said. And hopefully if you're a decent person, you have some common sense. I'm expecting most of my audience to already have to already be Christian in a lot of ways. That's what I'm not acting as if that's going to be the case, but I anticipate, just knowing what circles I've been in, that people who are going to be listening to me are going to be more of a Christian persuasion. But wherever you're at, I think you'll have enough decent morality and decent common sense to immediately be repulsed by some of the quotes from mainstream ethicists and mainstream philosophers. These are award-winning philosophers. These people have written books. They have a large following in academia. And so I'm just I've done my research. I've gone in and read some of their things, and I'm just going to show it to you today. So as my shocker to open up this presentation, let's talk about Peter Singer. He has, of course, that he's been a little bit more of a household name now, not only because he's an award-winning philosopher, but also because of some of his unconventional and really disturbing perspectives. And so right here in his book, Practical Ethics, I'm quoting here from his 3rd edition in 2011, Peter Singer writes, quote, similarly, so I'm a little bit out of context here, not totally out of context, but I am taking it from a paragraph here. So he's in the middle of making a point. I'm not going to shy away from that. I wouldn't say it's completely out of context because he does stand by what he says here. But I am taking it out of a longer paragraph. I'm not showing you all the reasoning that he did to get here. I'm just showing you where he got to. So I think that's fair to say about this. And he'll own up to this, even if you press him on this. If you were in a room with him, he would own up to what he says here. So I'm not taking him out of context and making him sound like a monster. This is his actual stance. He says, quote, similarly, the preference, utilitarian reason for respecting the life of a person cannot apply to a newborn baby. Okay, not a fetus, not an unborn baby, a newborn baby. Newborn babies cannot see themselves as beings that might or might not have a future, and so they cannot have a desire to continue living. For this same reason, if a right to life must be based on the capacity to want to go on living, or on the ability to see oneself as a continuing mental subject, a newborn baby cannot have a right to life. And yes, you heard that correctly. I'm not going to reread it again. I know it's shocking. You can rewind it and hear me read it again, or even find his book and read it for yourself. But he is saying here that newborn babies do not have the right to life because he bases the right to life on the ability to see oneself as a continuing mental subject and your ability to then make the decision that you want to go on living. If you don't have that ability, then you don't have the right to life. And he doubles down on this and he goes on. Finally, this is a little bit later, and it's the same page or two. It's in the same section of his book, but it is a little. I did skip some portions. So again, take it with a bit of a grain of salt because I'm picking and choosing sections here. But again, he owns up to all of this, and I'm not taking it out of context. I'm just removing the reasoning that you saw for how he got to this point of view, and I'll explain some of that reasoning later on. But this is the stance that he's taking. Finally, a newborn baby is not an autonomous being capable of making choices. And so to kill a newborn baby cannot violate the principle of respect for autonomy. In all this, the newborn baby is on the same footing as the fetus, and hence fewer reasons exist against killing both babies and fetuses than exist against killing those who are capable of seeing themselves as distinct entities existing over time. So one thing I can actually salvage here from Peter Singer that I can agree with personally is that there aren't really, whatever reasons you can put forth for killing a fetus seem to also apply for reasons to kill a newborn baby. I see a lot of overlap there. People say it's okay to kill an unborn baby if, for example, the parents cannot afford to keep it. It's going to ruin them financially. It's going to hurt the mother's career and things like that. And so he is not really addressing these, but he does say in a general sense that those reasons that you would put forward towards killing an unborn baby do apply towards a newborn baby as well. It might help the mother in her career a lot to kill her newborn baby, right? She's dedicating a lot of time and effort to that newborn baby. It's almost more of an argument to kill a newborn baby because the newborn baby actually does take so much more effort to continue to care for than not that being pregnant isn't time consuming and has all those things coming towards it. But I'm not going to get into like a whole abortion discussion here, but Peter is recognizing here that arguments put forth to kill a fetus, he is also applying those to kill a newborn baby. And while I agree with him that there's a lot of overlap, I don't want to kill any of them. I don't want to kill a fetus and I don't want to kill a baby. And he's saying it's okay to put them both in the same category and kill all of them. Now, he's not arguing for killing all the babies, but I'm just saying each one. I don't want to misrepresent him. But newborn babies and fetuses, it is morally okay and permissible to kill any of them. Okay, he's not arguing to exterminate all of them, obviously, but it's morally okay to him to kill any of them. And so he even says that to kill a newborn baby does not violate the principle of respect for autonomy. You're not violating the baby's autonomy because the baby doesn't have autonomy yet. It doesn't meet that criteria. He goes on to say there should be at least some circumstances in which a full legal right to life comes into force. So he's like, there is a line somewhere where you have a right to life and no one should be able to kill you. Where does he put this, though? He says not at birth, but only a short time after birth, perhaps a month. And he doesn't even believe a month. Okay, he doesn't even believe that after a month, suddenly this baby has the right to life. But he puts it there as like a safety net. Okay, he says this would provide an ample safety margin mentioned previously. So he had already brought up this thing about a safety net. He says, I don't know where bodily autonomy comes into play, but just to be safe, let's put it at a month. It's probably later than a month. You can probably kill a 2-month-old and it would be okay. But since we're not sure where personal autonomy comes in, let's just put that right at a month as a practical application. And again, I'm showing you where he got to without showing you how he got there, but he will own up to these statements. And I'm not just taking them wildly out of context. This is something he believes. And you can tell just by the way he wrote it. He's literally making policy positions. He's taking policy positions that say it's okay to kill a child up to about 1 month. And he's like, that's within that safety net, right? A month and a day is probably fine too, but we have to draw a line somewhere. So let's put it at a month. He says we should put very strict conditions on permissible infanticide. But these restrictions, this is, I can't even believe this. This is when it gets very mind-boggling to me. So he does want restrictions. He doesn't want to kill, like I said, he doesn't want to kill all babies. There should be restrictions on which babies we kill. But there's a big but here. Quote, but these restrictions should owe more to the effects of infanticide on others than to the intrinsic wrongness of killing an infant. So we shouldn't do this often. We shouldn't kill babies all the time. But that's not because killing babies is wrong. He wants to make sure you know that. It's not because killing babies under a month is wrong. It's because it has a bad effect on people who are doing it, or on people involved in the situation. So mothers don't tend to want to kill their 1 month old. And so we probably shouldn't do it very often. But that's not because it's wrong, but it's because it's not really good for the mother to be killing her babies all the time. That's why. So Peter Singer, who is still around, I believe he's still alive today. He was alive last time I checked, though he's getting up there in age. But he is a award-winning philosopher, very well respected in academia. Again, well-read books. This is not a fringe guy on crazy YouTube channels, or he's not a fringe guy. He's very much in the mainstream for academic philosophy. He's treated, I guess, to be on the fringe in a lot of cases, I guess. Like, other people talk about him like he's a little bit more out there, which is good. But in terms of the circles that he's in and where he's respected, it's very much mainstream. It's books. You can buy his books off the shelf at Barnes & Noble. So now we come to the question, how do we get here, right? I removed that from, you have to read his book to find out exactly how he gets there. I'm not going to talk about Sanger specifically through all this, but how do we get here as a society? How do we get to a point where our philosophers, our leaders in academia are saying it's okay to murder a baby up to 1 month? What kind of worldview would lead to these conclusions? And can we even say as a society that infanticide is morally, objectively wrong in all circumstances, in all cases? Can we even say that as a society? Or are we so morally relativistic that it's, we can't say that it's wrong. We can't say it's totally wrong. How do we get here? And can we even at this moment say infanticide is a bad thing? It's a moral abomination. It's something that deserves not even it doesn't even deserve the slightest consideration for a good and just society. Can we even say that? I would suggest there are 2 reasons for the decline of ethics. I'm not going to say these are the only 2. I think there's enough thought on this and enough writings on this to say these are not exclusive. Okay, but this is from my reading and from my understanding. Again, I'm not some brilliant philosophical expert, but I have some training in apologetics and biblical studies and philosophy, and so I'm going to take a stab at it from somebody who's more in line with the scientific realm, but who's passionate about, again, topics of creation and human worth, and as a human being, right? I think anyone, and this is pretty rare for me to say this because I think too many people out there sit in their cars and pull out their phones and film things on TikTok and think other people, need to hear what they have to say. But I think on this case, on this particular issue, you do not have to be well educated. You do not have to be an expert in your field to talk about whether or not it's morally justified or morally okay or morally permissible to kill a 1 month old. Every human being has a right to say something on this. Okay, so again, I'm not the expert in philosophy. I have some training, but in this case, I think everyone deserves a right to kind of put their point of view in. So here's my point of view. I think that there are 2 reasons, not exclusive, but 2 reasons you can point to for the decline of our ethics and of our philosophy. The first is a philosophical commitment to scientism, and I will define scientism for you in a second. That's my first, a philosophical commitment to scientism. All right, not to science, but to scientism. Isms are very, very telling as a suffix, not a prefix, a suffix. That's a very, very telling end to a word. And then the second is the Darwinian explanation of the human experience. That one's going to be more of a focus today. So remember that, the Darwinian explanation of the human experience. Word choice is very intentional there. I spent a long time putting together that phrase. So let's start with a philosophical commitment to scientism. What in the world is scientism? And is it the same thing as science? It is actually not the same thing as science. It is defined as, first, the methods and attitudes typical of or attributed to the natural scientist. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the attitudes of a scientist. I'm talking about rather the second definition here, which is an exaggerated trust in the efficacy of the methods of natural science applied to all areas of investigation, as in philosophy, the social sciences, and the humanities. So what scientism is taking science, or really the scientific approach, right? The scientific method, and it's taking the scientific mindset and applying that to philosophy, to the social sciences, and to the humanities. Let me explain what this means. For pretty much all of human history, the social sciences, philosophy, and the humanities have been incredibly integrated with your religion or your metaphysics, your metaphysics and your ideas about the spiritual realm. That's always been linked to the social sciences. It's always been linked to philosophy. It's always been linked to the humanities. Does God exist is an important question in all of these areas. And so scientism basically says from the start, no, spirituality, God, and those religious ideas should be removed entirely. And we should take philosophy and social sciences and the humanities and strictly apply them only in areas of science. It's only that the physical world that applies to all of those. So you're taking God out of it, you're taking religion out of it, you're taking anything supernatural out of it, and you are assuming everything is explainable and livable based on that first story worldview, that everything is explainable through the scientific method, right? Through there's a sheerly scientific and physical approach. So hopefully that's well explained. I like that second definition there of what scientism means. So scientism, again, one more time, is trusting the methods of natural science to investigate philosophy, social sciences, humanities. This applies to the arts, the liberal arts, ethics, all these areas, strictly through the scientific method. Okay, and so this idea, and I'm going to summarize it. You can substitute a lot of words in here: scientism, materialism, naturalism. Even in that definition, the word natural appeared there, or the natural scientist from the first definition. So you can apply a lot of these things. Naturalism basically means nature is all there is, someone who operates on that assumption that sheer nature is all that exists. The materialist believes that only matter exists, there's nothing supernatural, it's only material. And so when you have this particular perspective, you are going to use that perspective when you do science, you're going to use that perspective when you do philosophy, and you're going to use that perspective when you do history. And so I've actually spoken about this in academic conferences before. I've given a presentation where I've talked about this at a scientific conference. Okay, the materialists actually have their own view of history as well as their own view of science and philosophy and ethics and all of those things. And the way they interpret history, this is very, very clear in their literature and in what they say. Their view of history is that we basically have total human knowledge about the world. And as that knowledge about the world increases, a need for belief in God decreases. And I even put together a very, very basic bare bones graph here of the secular view of the history of science. If you are not a Christian and you are strictly a materialist, you're not religious whatsoever, when you look at history, that's how you see it as. You see people who believed in God originally, but as they learned more about the world and more about the universe, their need for God shrank. And in today's day and age, we know so much about the universe that we really don't need the existence of God to explain all that much. Our need for God has very much dwindled. And so in our present day and age, we are basically at the end of this graph, right? We are at the very end where the need for God is at an all-time low and our scientific knowledge is at an all-time high. So I'm going to move a little bit. So I have a weird weird light shining on my neck. It's kind of weirding me out. So sorry if I shift a little bit. Okay. So let's continue. I have a couple of quotes here that basically show this exact thing. The materialist view of history. So Richard Dawkins, he's no historian, but he literally very obviously subscribes to this view. He writes that gaps in our knowledge shrink as science advances, and God is threatened with eventually having nothing to do and nowhere to hide. So in his mind, God has always existed in simply things we don't understand. And once we come to understand them, we no longer have a need for God. He very obviously has this point of view. It's present throughout all. If you're familiar with his works, you've seen him approach history in this way. Jerry Coyne, a contemporary of Richard Dawkins, obviously they're both still, they're still alive, so they're contemporaries. But Coyne specifically, I think, came to prominence in the immediate post-Dawkins, the post-rise of Dawkins. Jerry Coyne kind of followed him up. He's in the, and he's from Chicago. He's from the University of Chicago, I believe, is where he's at. And he says, if the history of science shows us anything, it is that we go nowhere when labeling our ignorance God. So in his mind, God simply represents what we don't know. It's literally the God of the gaps. They both believe that God, even the God of the Bible, is simply the God of the gaps. We use God to explain the things we don't understand. This is an entire approach to history. So when I gave you my approach to history in part 1 of this series, this is obviously a completely different approach to history, where these scientists are saying, we go nowhere when our ignorance, the things we don't know yet, is labeled God. So their alternative is, look, we still don't know some things about the universe, but let's stop pretending that those things are God, and let's admit that we don't need God anymore because we already know enough that even those gaps that we still have, we have faith that those gaps will be filled in without needing to reference God. And for that, they're probably thinking about things like the origin of life. We don't know how the origin of life came about, but we'll figure that out eventually. We don't need to just postulate that God did it. So I won't spend too much more time on that, but just so you know that the materialist view of history, that's exactly what it is. It's that graph that I just showed you. The more we know about the universe, the less we know about God, or the less we need God to explain it. So if you were taking notes, I'd want you to basically write this down as that kind of summary, which is that religious faith is viewed as contrary to scientific progress. So if you have that view of history, then that's obviously what you think now. You think religious faith is going to hinder scientific progress because all it does is keep alive that ignorant view, that these gaps in our knowledge are where faith in God fills in those gaps. And if you believe that, then you obviously believe that faith in religion or faith in God is contrary to scientific progress, because scientific progress fills those gaps in without your God. So that's a very clean summary of the argument that I just made for the materialist view of science. And that is a philosophical commitment, okay? Even though they have their own interpretation of history, one that I disagree with, you've already seen my interpretation of history. I've hopefully demonstrate that even the scientific method itself came about through Christian doctrine, like literally biblical Christian doctrine directly brought about the scientific method. So obviously I don't believe that God and science are antithetical to one another. But this is a philosophical commitment by materialists that says all we need to know, we can explain through science and the scientific method. That's it. There's nothing beyond the realm of the scientific method. Science can reach everything that there is to know. There is nothing outside of science's reach. And I think to a lot of people that already loses them. And I think that's why you've seen a significant resistance to Richard Dawkins and the new atheism movement, because a lot of people inherently realize the things that Richard Dawkins says do not correspond to their personal experience. And the personal experience of most people who have lived and will ever live, who are born and raised already understanding that faith and belief in God are at least something that we inherently wrestle with, and that it's not something you can easily dismiss by citing scientific progress. Here's an evolutionary biologist basically admitting this. Mayer, again, the evolutionary biologist, said, quote, The Darwinian revolution was not merely the replacement of one scientific theory by another, but rather the replacement of a worldview in which the supernatural was accepted as a normal and relevant explanatory principle, by a new worldview in which there was no room for supernatural forces. So this is not a creationist saying this. This is not a Christian saying this. This guy was an evolutionary biologist, and he recognized that when Darwin came through and the Darwinian revolution that happened in the 1800s, this was not just a new scientific theory that was accepted. This was also a worldview that said, we no longer need God to explain things. We no longer need supernatural forces to explain things. Darwin was like the last part of my graph, right? Scientific knowledge is going up, 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 up. And like Darwin kind of finished it off, and we reached that threshold where, oh, I guess we don't need supernatural mechanisms to explain why the world looks the way it does today. So there is a honest evolutionary biologist admitting that this is a philosophical commitment. Okay, this is something that people believed because they chose to as a primary assumption, and then base their work on that assumption. And you can argue that it's evidence-based. You can argue that people have believed in God less as we've learned more, or something like that. But you still have to recognize that this is something that's happening inside people's minds. This is philosophical. They're saying, I think that science can explain everything about the world. And if we don't know something yet, we just rely on science to explain it eventually. That's philosophical commitment. They can change their mind and believe in the supernatural, but they choose not to. And that's not based on the scientific method itself, right? If the scientific method can't touch the supernatural, then how can you say with certainty that the supernatural doesn't exist based on the scientific method? You can't. By your own admission, the scientific method doesn't touch miracles, right? Or the supernatural. So if you are a materialist and you don't accept miracles, and you do that on the basis of the scientific method, which by your own admission cannot recognize when a miracle has happened, then you have robbed yourself the possibility of ever coming across a miracle. And if miracles did exist, you wouldn't believe them anyway. So it's not a very scientific approach. It's actually a philosophical commitment that says there are no miracles, there is nothing supernatural. And even though you can defend it with some scientific evidence that says, hey, look, we used to think God did this, but now we think this did it. You can do that, but it's not going to save you from the fact that you're making a philosophical commitment here. Carl Sagan said, the cosmos is, this is a pretty famous quote from him, the cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be. I don't know how you can prove that scientifically using the scientific method, because if there's anything that is outside of the cosmos, your scientific method will never actually recognize it. And so your whole system, your operation is flawed from the beginning. You won't actually find the supernatural because your own methodology doesn't recognize it. And then you respond to that by saying, well, it doesn't exist. So you're already making this commitment philosophically that there's no supernatural things whatsoever. Okay, and now we come to the second thing that I think you can notice in terms of the history of philosophy. This is another thing that comes into play that fractures our ethics entirely. That is the Darwinian explanation of life. All right. And it's getting a little warm in here, so I'm going to shed a layer here. Okay, the Darwinian explanation of life. Here is one interesting thing. And it's where a lot of Darwinists might disagree with here. But if you give an explanation for the origin of humankind, you also kind of have to explain everything that comes with humankind. So humankind is full of unique ideas that you can find nowhere else in creation. Humans have unique behavior. We have ethics. We have really deep emotions. We develop social norms. We have very complex psychology. We have a sense of justice. We have beauty and the arts, right? We recognize beauty and we recognize artistic merit. And we recognize things like good and evil. Now, though a lot of these things, most of them, maybe even all of them, are somewhat also in the animal kingdom. And this is what a lot of scientists will point to as well. And they'll say, well, animals have an idea of, they have unique behavior, they have very complex behavior, they experience complex emotions, they have social norms. And while that's true, that doesn't mean you don't have to explain them. And what we can do as Christians who don't accept their view of evolution is we can look at how Darwin explains these things, and we can measure it up to our own experience. And so that's why I like to call all of these things the human experience. That's not to say animals don't experience any of those, but it is to say that all of these things are integral to the human experience. And this is one of the things that kept me from believing evolution, even as I learned more about zoology and as I got an education in science and learned about the evidence for evolution, right? If you had talked to me before I went off to college, I would have said I don't believe in evolution because there's no scientific evidence for it. And I've been to college now, and I've learned a lot of scientific evidence that evolution explains. You can see in part 2 of my video, I'm not nearly as critical of the theory of evolution as I once was. But I never actually flirted with belief in evolution because I recognized that Darwin's theory has an explanation for all of these things that are integral to the human experience. And I found that explanation to be supremely lacking. And you can see there's a video on YouTube. It's not a very viral or huge video, but I'm at a creation conference. I'm at the International Conference on Creationism, ICC. And someone stopped me and interviewed me on my kind of position. And at that point, that's one where I was really starting to realize and accept that there's a lot of evidence for the theory of evolution. And so when I gave this interview, I basically said on the interview, which I'm not sure the interviewer appreciated it, so I apologize to him if I came across like an evolutionist, but I said, look, evolution explains a lot of things, but one of the things it doesn't explain well is the human experience. And I value the human experience way more than I value how rock layers came to be formed or how fossils ended up in the ground. I care a lot about whether or not a theory or worldview explains the human experience. And if it doesn't explain the human experience very well, I'm out. Okay. That's basically what I said in this interview. So I don't know if you can find it. It's somewhere out there. Just type in maybe my name. I'm trying to think of the YouTube channel that was part of. But regardless, you can see that like I'm not making stuff up about my stance on this. I came about to this conclusion in a very straightforward way, which is there's actually a lot of scientific evidence for evolution, but would you look at that, it really does not explain why we have such a loyalty to justice, right? Why we value justice so much, why there's something called good and something called evil, why we recognize beauty in the arts. I don't value evolution's explanation of those things. So we'll get into that more. But again, a reminder of what scientism means. Scientism means that you basically have to take the scientific method, which is, something that must be disprovable. Every theory must be disprovable. And we accept whatever theory has the most evidence behind it. It's all physical and in this reality. And you have to take that approach to all of those things, the human experience. How does pure science, no religion, no spirituality, no God, how does just science explain the human experience? And I think the Darwinian explanation for the human experience is so flawed that the people who subscribe to it eventually end up with a very flawed and corrupt moral view, such as Peter Singer, who suggests that we can commit infanticide and that's morally okay. And he's not doing that because he believes that God thinks it's okay. He's doing that because he is a good Darwinist. Like there's no other way to say it. And he's a really good Darwinist, and he is following his logic to its logical conclusion. All right. And that's where we get to another famous evolutionist, particularly evolutionary biologist. This was Thomas Huxley. He was famously known as Darwin's bulldog because Charles Darwin did not actually like getting into debates and back and forths about his theory. So he let Thomas Huxley do that for him. So Huxley has a lot of books on evolution. They're extremely dense. I had a really hard time getting through one. I forget which one I started reading, but barely made it, like didn't even make it into a chapter. Like he is a very, very smart person and wrote very, very dense literature. But there he is. He was known as Darwin's Bulldog, and he gave a lecture, which is a lot more easy to understand than his books. And his lecture was titled Evolution and Ethics in 1893. So just before the turn of the century, just before the turn of the millennia, really, he's a little over 100 years before the turn of the millennia. Huxley is about to, he's giving us basically a lecture on what evolution means to ethics moving forward as a human species. In this lecture, Huxley makes very revealing admissions about ethics. You can find this lecture, the transcript, it's online. That's what I did to prepare for this video. And it's out there. So look up Evolution Ethics by Thomas Huxley. So you can even correct me if I'm misrepresenting it, but I don't think I am. So he says that evolution can explain why people act good and why people act evil, but it does not offer a basis for preferring good over evil. So the evolution theory explains well the observational data that some people do good things and some people do really bad things. But what it does not give you is an objective reason for saying that the good things people do are better than the evil things people do. And he admits this in his lecture. He even said that the ethically best life is one that is combating behaviors that natural selection promotes. So when we say that it is good to do things like love your neighbor, look out for other people, care for others who are around you, contribute to society, those things are not the same as the ideas that natural selection promotes. Natural selection promotes self-preservation, looking after you and your own kids, and not and competing with the people around you. So natural selection promotes things that are contrary to what we say are ethically good. He says ethics and evolution continue to be at odds, and evolution may win out in the end. We might turn into, revert back to the beasts who are purely doing things out of self-preservation in the natural world, right? We might go back to a dog eat dog, the fittest survive society. But we should choose the ethical route anyway. We should try and be ethical, even though there's no real basis for doing so, and even though it might not matter much in the long run. That's essentially what he's saying in his essay. So he's encouraging people, we should be ethical because really, we think it's the better way. We feel like it's the better way, but evolution does not give us a basis for going in that direction. So you can see, hopefully, where if we start off from this basis, we can end up saying things that are a little more drastic. Like you can see how this is one stepping stone that leads to infanticide is okay. Hopefully you can see that. I'm trying to kind of build in that direction, right? I started off with the banger with the look, Peter Singer's okay with infanticide, and now I'm trying to indicate some things that got us to that point, and hopefully that logic works. Thomas Huxley then said, quote, "Let us understand once and for all that the ethical progress of society depends not on imitating the cosmic process, still less in running away from it, but in combating it." So his idea is basically ethics means we go against the cosmic process, by which he means, of course, evolution. We should go against evolution. That's what it means to be ethical, which is an interesting take from somebody who is an evolutionist. All right, and he's not the only one. He was a little bit earlier on than John Dewey, but I do want to cite John Dewey here, a very telling philosopher. But John Dewey made his 2 cents known in his day. He actually disagreed with Huxley on this position. He wrote an essay called Evolution and Ethics. He argued that ethics and evolution are actually complementary. They agree with each other because his point is that Huxley is not factoring in a society. Huxley was thinking of bare bones evolution, like evolution in the wild. But we do not live in the wild. We live in a society. So civilizations thrive when people act morally good. So Dewey is a little bit more nuanced than Huxley, and he points out that ethics and evolution are complementary only within civilizations. If you're doing it out in the wild, then yeah, sure, evolution says the fittest survive, dog eat dog, all of those things. But in a society or a civilization, civilizations thrive when you are ethical, when you act and behave good. And so evolution does favor moral action when we live in societies. Now, I must say, this from an evolutionary biology standpoint. I have some disagreements with John Dewey on this, mostly because there are lots of societies in nature where it's actually beneficial for organisms to cheat on one another and kill one another and do things that we would consider immoral. So even now, even in a society today, I could go out and steal something right now, and it would be better off for me if I don't get caught. And so, even in that sense, right, just like in animal societies, it's still good to look out for yourself and act selfishly and do things that are immoral because you still thrive. But I'll give him this: Dewey's position makes more sense than Huxley's position. Within civilizations, evolution would say acting ethically, it makes you more a likable person. People like you because you share more and you're honest and you act and behave in a way that we think is good. And you're more likely to be trusted. You're more likely to thrive in a society because you act morally good. He says, we have then no reason here to oppose the ethical process to the natural process. The demand is for those who are fit for the conditions of existence in one case as well as in the other. It is the conditions which have changed. Now, this is telling when he says it is the conditions which have changed. So he's saying the conditions of dog eat dog in the wild, that's one thing. But natural selection means if you are fit to survive, then you work well in the conditions that you are in. But if the conditions change, then your different behaviors are selected to survive. Okay? Animals that live on an island in the Galapagos have different conditions from animals that live on the mainland of, say, North America. They have different conditions, and so different behaviors work better for survival. Okay? And that's key. Within a society, you have different conditions than if you're not in a society. So it's not that rape, or I know YouTube kind of censors these things, so I probably shouldn't say that, but really horrible things like assault and murder, those horrible things are not permissible in a society, not because they're intrinsically morally wrong, but because that they're bad under those conditions. So John Dewey is laying the precedent for nothing whatsoever being actually morally wrong, but that all of these things are only morally wrong under certain conditions, and that when we live in a society, those conditions say that those things are bad. So hopefully you recognize that. It is the conditions which have changed. It's not that things are morally bad or morally good. It's that conditions that you live under say some things are morally bad and some things are morally good. All right, now we come to another philosopher, biologist. E.O. Wilson was a famous scientist. E.O. Wilson was a very good writer, very engaging. I've read his book on the meaning of human existence or something like that. He's a very good writer. For the life of me, I do not understand why he is a lauded thinker, why his ideas were so praised, or why he was praised as a scientist. I guess I haven't read enough of him or been exposed to enough of his content. I don't know what it is, but I have yet to come across an E.O. Wilson thought that is incredibly profound to me. I just haven't. He is one who proposed taking 50% of the globe and setting it aside for nature. He does not value really conservation very much. He just wants us to leave nature alone, and that's his view of conservation. And so he wants to literally set aside half the globe for nature, which would mean displacing indigenous tribes that are still living on their homeland. It means, which is not very politically correct, it means displacing people who have been living there for a while who aren't indigenous, right? It means just dramatically negatively impacting millions of people worldwide just because he thinks that that's the best way to bring nature back somehow. Anyway, I could dive into more E.O. Wilson thoughts, but I'm just going to talk about him and his view of ethics. He was more known as a scientist for studying uh, social insects, insects that live in groups, not as loners. So, like ants. He studies those, and then he writes books about human ethics and the meaning of human existence while referencing social insects. And just again, I'm sure he has some good thoughts out there. I just haven't run across them yet. So he proposes in it. Oh, look, my book that I'm citing him in is the book that I've read, The Meaning of Human Existence. He writes that morality, and by morality, he means really part of the human existence. All right. So again, this is all Darwinism trying to explain the human existence. And this is the part that I think Darwinism completely fails. And so he proposes that morality, by which he means moral conundrums that we face in life, whether or not we should do this or we should do that, A or B, right? Which doors do we go through in a moral sense? He says that this conflict is a conflict between individual selection and group selection. So he's getting even more nuanced than John Dewey did. And John Dewey was more nuanced than Thomas Huxley was. E.O. Wilson is saying basically that natural selection favors selfish individuals but selfless groups, which explains our altruism, our inward desire to do things for other people, right? Why do we feel so good when you help somebody else out, right? When I go out of my way and I say, I pick up, someone dropped a wallet, and I pick up the wallet and I chase down the person. I say, hey, here, I could have taken this money. I mean, hopefully you don't say that, but you're like, basically you could have taken the money, but you say, look, I saw you drop this wallet. I know this is yours. Here you go. You dropped your wallet. Why do you feel so good inside when you do something like that? You think, I did something good today. But then why do we also feel a temptation to take the money, right? Because you pick up the wallet, you might think, I could really use this money. There's $200 in cash in here. No one will ever know that I took it. I will get away with this scot-free, and I could really use this $200. Why do we feel that temptation? But then why do we then overcome that temptation and give the wallet back to the person who dropped it? Well, here's the reason. We have the desire to take the money because natural selection says the fittest survive, right? And you as an individual would be better off with that money than somebody else. You would be favored. You should take that money because you found it and it's advantageous to you to take it. That's why we feel tempted to do it. But sometimes we don't take the money and we give the wallet back to the person who dropped it because natural selection also says that your society will flourish the best if you are selfless. If we were all the kind of people who don't take the money and give the wallet back to somebody who dropped it, our society will do better than societies full of selfish people. So that explains, this is a Darwinian explanation for the entire human morality or our experiences with morality, why we choose one thing over another. That's exactly what this is. And this is E.O. Wilson's explanation. Natural selection favors selfish individuals, but selfless groups or societies. And that's why we have these conundrums. And it makes sense. I mean, if I accepted the theory of evolution and I did not believe in God, I might be tempted to take this view because it adequately explains it from a biological standpoint. This is why I really, really like helping other people, but why also I really want to just look out for myself. But I also want to point out here, and this is why it doesn't sit well with me. This is a descriptive claim. So his approach explains the descriptive claim of why we have to make this decision, why we decide whether to be selfish or to be selfless. Right? He explains how we have that predicament. What does he not explain? He doesn't explain why one of those options is objectively better than the other option. Evolution cannot tell you why giving the wallet to the other person is morally better than keeping the wallet and keeping the money for yourself. Right? It can explain. It gives you one reason why it's good, because your society will flourish. But it doesn't. But you could also just as easily take the cash and be better off yourself personally. And the theory of evolution can't give you a reason why you're doing anything morally wrong. And so If I decided from early on in my life, if I read E.O. Wilson's book and I think, this explains why I have this intrinsic uh, intrinsic decision inside of me, why I'm tempted to do one thing, but I kind of want to do the other thing. Now, if I decided early on that, you know what, if all that is stopping me from being selfish is this idea that my society might thrive better, my society is doing pretty good. Okay. My society is all right. If just I am selfish, it's not going to hurt anybody. And so I say, you know what, I have these two conflicting um, explanations here. I have two conflicting ideas and urges inside of me, right? And it's not a sinful urge and a righteous urge. It's just two urges, equally coherent, equally good urges. What if I just look out for myself? I take the money for myself. What every opportunity I get, I look out for myself. I don't care so much for my society. Evolution can't tell you you're wrong in doing that. It just says, okay, like you're going to be better off than the person next to you. You're as a society, you're just going to be slightly worse off than if you shared with everybody else and you were selfless. So it's not an objective moral structure. It's just you have a decision to make, and this is why you feel like you want to make either decision. It's a descriptive claim with no prescriptive claim. It tells you how things are, but it does not tell you which decision you should or should not make. The eternal conflict, that's what he calls it, the eternal conflict. Every single person has this internal conflict of which one should I do? Should I be selfless or should I be selfish or selfless? You know what I'm saying. The eternal conflict is not God's test of humanity. It is not a machination of Satan. It is just the way things worked out. You are not tempted to do something bad because you have a sinful nature. And then you're not convicted by your sin because you have a spiritual relationship with God. That's not how things are working. What's actually happening is it's just the way things are based on the way evolution works. And this just does not sit well with me. This does not match the human experience whatsoever. I am not going to accept a perspective that says that, sexual assault is not morally abhorrent. I'm just not. Okay. It's intrinsic to me that is a corrupt, evil, unjustifiable thing. And so I don't think that morality can be reduced to, social norms or whether or not it benefits your society or whether or not it benefits yourself. I don't think that's what's going on here. And I don't think that sits well with most of us as humans who are living in the human experience. All right, some problems with the Darwinian explanation besides the ones that I've just blatantly explained to you while I'm going along, right? This PowerPoint's supposed to just kind of show you what they think, and then now I'm going to get into the problems. So I might start repeating myself here because I got a little bit ahead of myself, but here we go. So Huxley admits that evolution does not choose between good and evil. Okay, evolution explains why we have good and evil. It just doesn't explain why good is better than evil. And that's a problem. It's pretty self-evident why that's a problem, and I'm shocked that Huxley didn't offer more of an explanation why he thinks we should choose good over evil. He literally says we just should. Dewey's ethics are relative to one's environment. Evil acts are only evil in certain contexts. So in Dewey's mind, remember, is it only the conditions that have changed? So if conditions say that it's okay to do X, then it's okay to do X. And this disturbs me because I can think of many social circles where it is okay to do morally corrupt things. I mean, look at what we've seen recently with the peace deals over in the Middle East, and some of the groups of people, some of the things that they do because their society says it's okay, are completely abhorrent. Okay, these terrorist groups, that's a society, that's a social structure, and their conditions say you behave in this way or we're going to kill you. Evolutionarily speaking, you are morally obligated, ethically obligated to do what they tell you to. If they say you need to become a terrorist, you need to, kill Jews or whatever, whatever they're telling you to do, evolutionary ethics says do it, because if you don't, they will hurt you. E.O. Wilson's worldview explains our evil temptations, but cannot condemn them as morally wrong. It's perfectly fine to succumb to those evil temptations, because all it really is you looking out for yourself in the world of natural selection. You can't morally judge me for looking out for myself rather than helping out the society, because you can do it. You can do it just as well as I can. It's just a descriptive claim. It's not a prescriptive claim. E.O. Wilson says, humanity, I argue, arose entirely on its own through an accumulated series of events during evolution. We are not predestined to reach any goal, nor are we answerable to any power but our own. Only wisdom based on self-understanding, not piety, will save us. There will be no redemption or second chance vouchsafed to us from above. We have this one planet to inhabit and this one meaning to unfold. Okay, so he did not get to his conclusions by anything other than his belief in Darwinism and his belief in evolution. Again, I'm not critiquing evolution from a scientific point of view here. I think evolution works for the most part from a scientific point of view. And a lot of creationists, will get mad at me for saying that, but that's my stance. Okay, I've seen a lot of the data, and I don't think it's perfect, but I do think evolution explains a lot of that data. But as soon as you leave the science classroom and you start looking at the human experience, and you start looking at why we have a inherent sense of right and wrong, and why we have a human experience, Darwinism completely falls apart in its explanation of those things. And make no mistake, these corrupt views of morality do come directly from a Darwinist point of view. These are Darwinists, and they are doing ethics with a basis in Darwinism. Jerry Coyne, who I showed earlier with Richard Dawkins, he's a biologist, and he wrote a book. And at the end of his book called Why Evolution is True, he starts talking about why people are so panicked about teaching evolution in schools. And he's like baffled as to why. He's like, it's just a scientific theory. No, it's not, Jerry Coyne, because just a scientific theory just told me that it's okay to commit infanticide, and there's no real good reason not to succumb to our temptations to be completely selfish people. And until you can give me a moral and objective reason why those things are bad based on Darwinism, then I'm sorry, it's not just a scientific theory. So I just completely disagree with that approach. It's not just a scientific theory. It has to explain the human experience, and it fails to explain the human experience to any degree of decency. C.S. Lewis understood this perfectly, even though he did believe in evolution. He said the Christian and the materialist hold different beliefs about the universe. They can't both be right. The one who is wrong will act in a way which simply doesn't fit the real universe. And I think Nancy Pearcey built off of this. She's the one that I talked about at the very beginning, who talked about the two-story worldview. She very much hit the nail on the head with this. She points out that a scientist who is a materialist in the science laboratory. And then when he goes home at night to be with his family, he doesn't act like materialism is true. He acts like the human experience is a real spiritual thing. He acts like he truly does love his family, even though in the laboratory, he has to believe that his love is just a evolutionary adaptation so that he doesn't actually kill his own children or kill his wife or outcompete them for resources. The love he feels is literally just a evolutionary adaptation that makes sure his genes continue to flourish. That's all it is. And so his lifestyle in the laboratory does not match his lifestyle at home. And C.S. Lewis says, if your worldview up in your head is not corresponding to the real universe, you've got the wrong view of the universe. So the theory of evolution is not just a scientific theory. It also offers an explanation for the human experience, and its explanation for the human experience does not match up with the human experience. It just does not match up with the real universe. And so that's why, even as I started to learn about the different scientific things that evolution explains very well, I never once thought, I guess this is true, because the logical conclusion to that is a deconstruction of basic ethics, basic morality, and the human experience as a whole, right? Our sense of justice, our understanding of right and wrong. I could go on, and you could too. Now, another big problem is that it's self-refuting, which, I probably should have started with that. If an idea is self-refuting, you already know it doesn't work on its own 2 feet. So let me explain. Peter Singer said, "We cannot just rely on our own intuitions." Singer is the guy who wants to kill infants, newborn infants. He says, "We cannot just rely on our own intuitions, even those that are very widely shared, since these could, as we have seen, be the result of our evolutionary heritage and therefore an unreliable guide to what is right." Thomas Nagel said the same thing. "Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which scientific naturalism itself depends." Let me explain what they're saying. Evolution says that our brains are hardwired and designed to accept that which helps us survive and reproduce. Think about this. We are designed to accept that which helps us survive, not that which is true. So the evolutionary mechanism that designed our brains and gave us our own intuition, that exact thing cannot justify what we actually think in our own minds, because our brains are filtering out what is harmful to us, not what is actually false. And it's filtering in what is useful to us, not what is true. Does that make sense? The evolutionary mechanism that designed us did not design us to accept truth. It designed us to accept only that which helps us survive. So under evolutionary assumptions and under the evolutionary worldview, we can only accept that which is useful to us to survive, and that may or may not match up with what is true. And this goes back to even the very like beginning of evolution, when our primitive ancestors were running through the woods and they heard a rustling in the trees and they thought that it could be a predator, it could not be a predator. Well, the ones that survived were the ones that thought that's probably a predator and ran away. The ones that said, that might not be a predator, so I'm just going to stay here and keep eating, the plants that I'm eating, those are the ones that got killed off. Now, the actual fact of the matter, maybe there was a rustling and maybe there wasn't a predator there. But the fact of the matter is, the ones that survived more often are the ones that ran away just in case there was a predator there. And that's often cited as the origin of religion, right? Maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't, but I'm going to act like there is a God because I'm screwed if there is not a God, or if there is a God. So they act like there's a God because they don't want to find out that they were wrong. They think that's the origin of religion. Like, I kid you not, this is I've seen this proposed as an origin of religious belief. And in my thinking, it's a refutation of evolutionary thinking, because if you're just filtering in what is helpful to survive, what is helpful to survive might not correspond with what is true. It might be helpful to believe lies in order to thrive. And so you cannot justify an evolutionary perspective based on your evolutionary perspective, because your evolutionary perspective doesn't give you what's right and wrong. Hopefully that all made sense, but it's basically the Darwinian worldview is completely self-refuting because it's based on not truth, but on our brains, which themselves are designed to only accept what helps us survive, not the truth. So we cannot even trust our own intuitions to tell us what is right and wrong, or what is true and untrue. It's not a truth filter, it's a pragmatic filter. Okay, so this is dramatic, okay? This is a big deal. And I want to point out what's at stake here is if we accept the Darwinian explanation, even though we recognize the Darwinian explanation is self-refuting, the things that are at stake are bountiful. And this is why I'm doing this series, really, when it comes down to it. This is why a creation reformation is so important. First of all, the idea of pragmatism spread quite a bit as a result of this idea that our brains only filter on what's useful. Some people went, so be it. Our brains only accept what is useful. Maybe we should all just accept what is useful. And so this has bled its way into education, where we're teaching kids to accept only that which is useful to them and not that which is true. You want to, if you think that this will help you, then go ahead and accept them. And I don't think I have a lot of kind of stats or information to back this up. I've done research into this area. I keep citing Nancy Pearcey. She's done a lot of work in this area. John Dewey, who I've quoted before, was big in bringing pragmatism into education spheres and teaching only that which helps students and not what is actually true. So it's removing actually the pursuit of truth from academic institutions, which is a dramatic problem. So I'm not really going to dive into that because I don't have that prepared in front of me. But maybe I'll do that for a future video. But that's something that you can do research on that. Nancy Pearcey writes all about it, and but that is something that has been documented. Is that we have moved into an era in education where we don't actually care or value what the truth is, because in our minds we don't actually believe there is a truth. We just believe that there are things that help us survive and there are things that don't. Utilitarianism is not better than this. So utilitarianism is a little bit what Peter Singer was saying, which is, that is a doctrine. He's not. I don't really know why I put Peter Singer's name in there. I don't think he's necessarily utilitarianist, but there's some overlap in his ideas there. Utilitarianism is a doctrine that the useful is the good, and that the determining consideration of right conduct should be the usefulness of its consequences. So we should only do things that are useful rather than what are not useful. And so I guess my point here is Peter Singer's idea was that infants are not really useful to us as a society, and so it's okay to discard them up to a certain point. I don't think that's his main point, but there is some overlap here. But basically, utilitarianism is no good either, even though that's something that's been proposed as a result of Darwinian worldview, that we should, as a whole society, only accept that what is useful to us and discard things that are not useful to us. Again, it's not truth-based. It's not truth-based. And we can't even approach things from a basis of what is true, because according to the belief system that we already have, we can't actually determine what is true and what is not true. Our faculties in our brain cannot get to that conclusion with any stretch of the imagination, with any certainty. They can't do it. They can only tell us with certainty what helps us survive. And so that's a dramatic problem for our own philosophy and for our own thinking. And suddenly the human experience is looking a lot worse from this evolutionary perspective. Man, I apologize for this light and shadow thing that's going on my face. Hopefully it's not a distraction to you. It's totally distracting me right now. I'm trying to find the shadow, but I'm not going to let it detract from this video. We're going to keep going. We're going to finish this off strong here. So I picked up this book a number of years ago. I actually purchased it from a Books A Million. It's called Hacking Darwin, and it's a perspective that's very compelling to me. This is a guy, Jamie Metzl, who I think is a complete idiot, not because he's not smart. He's obviously a very smart person, but because of the application of his worldview. So he wrote a book saying why it is okay to. I'm going to move forward a little bit. He's saying it is completely okay to genetically engineer humans to be exactly what we want them to be. It is okay to go in and change the genes of our children before they are born, so that when they are born, they match the characteristics that we want them to meet. We can change the IQ of our children. We can change the looks of our children. We can remove diseases from our children and make them exactly the children that we want them to be as parents. And he basically says that this is totally okay based on his worldview. Why? Because we are basically taking control of evolution. Whereas up until now, it was natural selection that was doing the selecting. Now we as humans can do the selecting, and we can choose what we want ourselves to be in the future. So what's at stake basically is that we are on the precipice of dramatic scientific progress. And if we're all accepting a Darwinian explanation for ethics, then the Darwinian ethics says go right on ahead. There are no moral reservations about this, and we can just go on and do whatever we want. So, and I'm not saying, like, I don't want to misrepresent atheists and say that just because you're an atheist, you're going to go and murder and assault a bunch of people. Absolutely not what I'm saying. But I'm saying within the realm of science, where scientific progress has given us the most dangerous technologies known to man, from this point and from this perspective, the Darwinian view does not give us a good roadmap forward for using the technology and using the scientific progress that we have. So Jamie Metzl wrote in his book, Hacking Darwin, from this point onward, our species will take active control of our evolutionary process by genetically altering our future offspring into something different than what we are today. We are, in other words, in the process of hacking Darwin. We are stepping in and taking over from natural selection to engineer for ourselves what we want our species to be in the future. And this is very, very dangerous thinking, but he is all for it. He is completely on board with engineering the future of our species because his starting assumption and his starting philosophy is Darwinism and the theory of evolution. So this scares me, right? This book terrified me to read it. I didn't quite finish it, but I read enough to really grasp his argument and the thrust of his perspective, and it definitely terrifies me as a Christian. I believe that there are moral rights and wrongs, and there are things that we should not do in the scientific field, but we're doing them anyway right now, and we're going to keep going forward with them because in our minds, all we're doing is taking control of our own evolutionary history. We are choosing what direction we go in instead of natural selection. And so we come full circle. Hopefully I've shown you the problems with the Darwinian philosophy, and that is exactly how we get to where we are today. So even Charles Darwin in the 1800s was writing that the murder of infants has prevailed on the largest scale throughout the world and has been met with no reproach. Infanticide, especially of females, has been thought to be good for the tribe. So Darwin is pointing out here that if we build our society based on Darwinian ethics, which is what works as a society we should keep and what doesn't work as a society we should throw away, if we accept that, the murder of infants actually fits with what is good for society and not what is bad for society. Because guess what? We have had many civilizations over time practice child infanticide. And what we've seen, according to Darwin, is that these societies have not collapsed upon themselves. They have not done poorly. When the conquistadors arrived and the colonists arrived to see people being sacrificed in the altars of gods in South America, those civilizations were technically on a purely naturalistic mindset. They were thriving. The Mayans and Incas and Aztecs had ginormous civilizations. They were empires, and they were not being selected by natural selection for extinction. They were being selected for survival, and they practiced child sacrifice, and they practiced the sacrifice of children. So this brings us back to Peter Singer. He basically says that the absolute protection of the lives of infants is a distinctively Christian attitude rather than a universal ethical value. He's saying it's the Christians saying we can't kill our babies, right? That's a religious thing. That's not a naturalistic scientific mode of thinking. That's a religious attitude to not kill babies. He's literally saying, and that's crazy to me because Christians make the argument that it is a Christian basis that says you can't kill babies, and the atheists come back at us and they say, what do you mean? We don't want to kill babies. We don't think killing babies is okay, right? The atheists will come back and respond to us and say, atheists can be moral all the time. But Peter Singer is over here taking Darwinian ethics all the way to its logical point of view and saying, it's the Christians who are saying we shouldn't kill babies, not us. Richard Dawkins said, much as you might wish to believe otherwise, universal love and the welfare of the species as a whole are concepts which simply do not make evolutionary sense. Universal love makes no sense according to evolution. It is just a biological program designed to make sure you survive as a species or as a generation or as an organism. Okay, universal love, welfare of the species, not killing your babies. These are all things that Dawkins and Singer and other evolutionary thinkers are saying, whoa, this is not our idea. This belongs in the religion section. All right, this belongs with the Christians. So how do we fight this Darwinian shift? How do we fight this shift that's happened in academia that moves everything back to the Darwin's point of view? I think one movement that has been great at this is the intelligent design movement. They have caught so much flack for their work in in scientific field in their theory of intelligent design, which I'm not going to get into now. But they have things like fine tuning the universe and irreducible complexity, and they use those arguments to try and prove that there was a designer. They've caught a lot of flack for their work in science, and I do disagree with them on some things, scientifically speaking, because they don't tend to be young Earth creationists, though a few of them are. But basically, they have pushed back quite a bit in exposing the Darwinian materialist mindset, and they have given a great alternative view in terms of ethics and philosophy. And I honestly think that creationists should model that more. They should learn from the intelligent design movement in terms of pushing back against the philosophy, the corrupt philosophy of the Darwinian movement. So I just want to shout out the intelligent design movement and say they do some great things. I want to say that we should remind ourselves that this is not something that is new or different, this Darwinian shift. This is something that was brought up in scripture before in Romans 1. It's said people do not glorify God. They became vain in their own thinking and their own imaginations. Their foolish hearts were darkened, and God gave them up to their foolishness, right? And decided instead to honor images of birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things, right? Which has a pretty strange and almost eerie connection to evolution, right? We are saying our moral being is not because of a God. Our actions are not because of a God. We don't have this moral understanding because of a God. We have these because we inherited them from our evolutionary ancestors, which were birds and beasts and creeping things. Not that humans evolved from birds, but you get my meaning. So Romans 1 fits here very, very well, and it's very eerie how well that fits our current state of things. So how ultimately do we fight this Darwinian shift? I think young Earth creationism is the answer. I gave a shout out to the intelligent design folks who tend not to be young Earth creationists, but I think young Earth creationism is the answer because, like I said, I don't think the ID folks explain and give all the right answers here. I think that young Earth creationism's greatest strength is its explanation of the human experience. Young Earth creationism gives us the answers to the human experience that no other view actually gives us. It explains human rights by the image of God. We are made in the image of God, and therefore we all have human rights, regardless of whether or not we have Peter Singer's understanding of our future, right? And that we want to live. All of us have human rights because we are made in the image of God. It gives us a good understanding of moral evil. We have this compulsion to sin because of the original sin at the beginning of creation. But we also have a desire to do good things because general revelation suggests that we can do better things than what our temptation for evil has. All right, general revelation is a doctrine in Scripture that explains that very well. We have a foundation for morality found in Scripture. We can debate about how good that morality is. A lot of people have before, but the point is we have a basis for it, period. We have a basis for morality that the theory of evolution does not offer us. The theory of evolution gives us a basis for what works and what doesn't work for our lives. It does not give us a foundation for what is right and what is wrong, or what is true and what is untrue. And it even gives us a good understanding of creation right now and how it works, that natural disasters are things like creation groaning for a better future that God is going to provide, right? So young Earth creationism's greatest strength is explaining the human experience, whereas explaining the human experience is evolution's greatest weakness. So just in conclusion here, that's what I want to say. Creationism's greatest strength is, in fact, Christianity. It is the fact that the Scripture gives us an explanation for the human experience and why we have a sense of morality, why we have a foundation for saying why good is better than bad, which the Darwinists don't even say they can do. They say that they can't give us why good is better than bad. They can only tell us how it helps us survive. But creationism gives us this because creationism has Christianity behind it. A historical genesis, finally, this is like the doctrine that is the basis of young Earth creationism. It provides the basis for true moral ethics that all people inherently understand through general revelation. General revelation clicks, right? The right and wrong that we all inherently know, that atheists, according to their own admission, they know it's wrong to do certain things. They know it's right to do other things. And all of that fits very well with a historical interpretation of Genesis, right? And I think while theistic evolution can give us some answers, young Earth creationism gives us the best answer for why that is, why the human experience is the way it is, and why creation looks the way it is now. So, in conclusion, I want to echo some people that I've gotten the pleasure to know who have said things like this. My friend Stephen Lloyd has said we must make creationism normal again. Creationism must be a normal part of our theology because it offers us those great explanations to the human experience. Hans Madawemi as well has a new essay out on the New Creation website, New Creation Studies. And in this, he writes, I'm taking him a little out of context there, but read the whole article because it's great. He writes, Christians need to see that creationism makes the most sense of biblical Christianity. Young Earth creationism is the future of Christian theology, and the truth is on our side, right? We can actually speak to the truth because of what our philosophical basis is. And so that's the biggest reason why I continue to be Young Earth creationist today, not because I think it's a better scientific viewpoint than evolution, though ultimately I do, but I ultimately take this stance because evolution fails as an explanation for the human experience every step of the way. It is philosophically bankrupt, and everything that it results in is a corrupt sense of morality and right and wrong. And if we take that path as a society and take Darwinian ethics as a foundation for our society, we will be corrupt, right? We will take science in all the wrong directions, and we will take society in all the wrong directions, and we will ultimately abandon truth, which unfortunately is what we were seeing today. People are throwing out truth and instead replacing it with what works for them, right? In their personal lives, their personal autonomy. And that's explaining a lot of the problems that we see today. So thank you for making with me all the way through. This is the end of my 3-part series, Why We Need a Creation Reformation. And I hope this was informative and you learned a lot about philosophy and about history and about science. And that'll do it for me. But thank you for making this far, and stay tuned for more content from the Creation Reformation YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching, and it means the world. And hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.